Good evening, and hello again from the podium, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone enjoying their dinner? There you go. Or you're whistling. Either way, if you could find your seats. It's keynote speaker time, ladies and gentlemen. Let's go ahead and light the stage. That'll be a nice touch, I think. Here you go. Oh yeah, drink me in. Everybody good? Have a nice dinner? Everybody having fun? Yeah, some crowds clap then or make some noise. Yeah, you guys are going another way with it. That's just checking to see how we're all doing here. But now that you're focused, it is my privilege now to bring up our sponsor, our main sponsor, who's going to bring up our keynote speaker. I'm the liaison at this point, but I've met Christine Gervin, Senior Manager Director for MFS and our title sponsor. Please welcome Christine to the stage.
Thanks, Dave. So good evening, everybody. Bonsoir à tous. Usually when you're on a stage like that, it's customary to start with a joke. But the only problem tonight is that Dave was ahead of me. So absolutely no jokes tonight. I'll never measure up. So we're very proud today to sponsor the CFA Society Ottawa Forecast Dinner. And tonight it's my privilege to introduce Professor Christina Romer. Professor Romer is Professor of Economics at the University of California in Berkeley, and she's co-director of the program in Monetary Economics at the National Bureau of Economic Research. More particularly, Professor Romer is a specialist in economic history and macroeconomics, and she's best known for her work on the causes of the Great Depression and on the conduct and effects of macroeconomic policy, and I know that's some of the points that she will be speaking about tonight. And her current research focuses on the impact of financial crisis in advanced economies. But perhaps what sets Professor Romer apart from her esteemed colleagues is that she had the opportunity to apply her knowledge to a real-time situation and one of the worst economic downturns since the 1930s. From January 2001 until September of 2010, Professor Romer served as chair of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. And in that role, she helped formulate the response to the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent recession. So I know there's a lot of young folks in the room, but there's also a lot of us who were here at that time. And I must just say that it felt like a lifetime to me back in 2008 and 2009, and I think I can own quite a few of the gray hair on my hair to that time period. So I can scarcely imagine what it would have been like to be in the eye of the storm at the White House at that time. I'll finish by saying that Professor Romer graduated from the College of William & Mary, and she received her doctorate of philosophy degree from MIT. If you go to her CV online, you'll see that she is the recipient of many fellowships and grants. There's too many to really cite them all tonight. And she's also received many awards, and the most recent one that she was awarded earlier this year is the Robert Moore Award in the Humanity, Arts, and Social Science from MIT in recognition for her contributions in the field of economics. So sans plus tarder, je vous présente Professeur Romer. So please join me in welcoming Professor Romer.
Well, thank you. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be here this evening and to speak at the CFA annual forecasting dinner. And I need to start by admitting that I had a brief but very painful stint as an economic forecaster. I was one of those people that Dave made fun of earlier. So I began working for President Obama in November of 2008 during the transition period between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And the transition is a strange time in American government because the president has chosen his top advisors and they're working away, but they're not yet in office and so have no staff. And now, in the fall of 2008 was also an intense time for economic policy. So the financial crisis was in full swing, and President Obama wanted to have a fiscal stimulus ready to go as soon as he was inaugurated in January. And so as part of that effort, I had the job of putting together an economic forecast and helping to figure out how large the stimulus needed to be. And I wrote a public report that summarized our thinking and tried to make the case for an aggressive fiscal stimulus. And in that document, I included a graph that has haunted me ever since, right? So it showed what we anticipated would happen in the US, to the US unemployment rate without fiscal stimulus. That's the light blue line. And then what would happen to the unemployment rate with the proposed $800 billion Recovery Act. That's the dark blue line. And we thought that the stimulus would be very helpful and would shave about 2 percentage points off the unemployment rate relative to what otherwise would have happened. Now, as it turned out, the forecast of the effect of stimulus was delightfully accurate. A variety of nonpartisan academic studies have concluded that the Recovery Act probably did shave about 2 percentage points off the unemployment rate. Unfortunately, the baseline forecast was much too optimistic. And as a result, every time that I was called up to Congress to testify on some matter, Republican senators or representatives invariably put up an expanded version of the graph that looked like this, where the actual unemployment rate is shown in red. And they delighted in pointing out that the actual unemployment rate, this was after we had done the Recovery Act, was higher than the no stimulus baseline. Now, in my defense, I was not the only person to make an overly optimistic forecast in the fall of 2008. Indeed, since I had no staff or particular expertise in forecasting, I got my forecast by aggregating a number of highly respected private sector and government forecasts, including that of the usually excellent forecasters at the Federal Reserve. Nevertheless, I had chosen to own the baseline forecast and was frequently mocked for it. And I feel quite certain that the headline on my obituary will read, "Incorrectly predicted that unemployment would not go above 8% in 2009. So that's a long way of saying that even though this is the annual forecasting dinner, I am going to stay away from stark forecasts. Instead, what I want to use my time this evening to talk about is a crucial change in the economic policy-making process in Washington. One that I feel has had and will continue to have grave effects on policy decisions in the United States, and that will surely impact Canada and indeed much of the world. And two anecdotes, I think, sort of give you the sense or summarize the changes that I see in the policymaking process in the US. So one comes from 2009, when the Obama administration was debating healthcare reform. Now, as is probably well known, even in Canada, US healthcare spending has been rising rapidly for decades. And so any reform, especially one that expanded insurance coverage, as President Obama wanted to do, had to include actions that would slow the growth of healthcare spending per person. And the economics team as a group decided that an important way to restrain the growth of healthcare spending was to limit the favorable tax treatment of employer-provided health insurance. So in case you don't understand the American system, employer-provided health insurance in the US is not considered income and so is not taxed. And this feature of our tax code encourages very generous insurance plans and removes some incentives for cost containment. Now, President Obama's political advisors were concerned about the economist's recommendation. So John McCain, Obama's opponent in the 2008 election, had also urged changing the tax exclusion for health insurance. And candidate Obama had run some really scathing campaign ads on the issue. And the political team actually made us all sit down and watch those commercials because they wanted us to know what we were asking President Obama to do. But we made our case anyway. We discussed the evidence that the tax exclusion led to policies with lower cost sharing between consumers and insurers, and that a gold standard randomized study showed that greater cost sharing reduced healthcare spending with no adverse effects on patient outcomes. And President Obama was persuaded by the evidence, and a change in the tax treatment of generous health insurance plans made its way into the final health reform legislation. And to my mind, that was just sort of the high point of evidence-based policymaking in the US. The president did something incredibly hard and politically unpopular because he was convinced by the evidence that it was the right thing to do for the country. Well, our current administration has a somewhat different approach. So recently, President Trump actually boasted that he'd simply made up a claim that the US had a bilateral trade deficit with Canada as a way of justifying protectionist policies toward Canada, including reconsidering NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. He admitted that he had no idea of the actual number, but that a deficit sounded good. Now, for the record, we actually have a small bilateral trade surplus with Canada, and most economists will tell you that bilateral trade positions are incredibly hard to interpret and are a poor indicator of unfair trade practices. But that's almost of secondary importance. What distresses me more is the lack of respect for evidence in the current policymaking process. The facts and analysis seem to matter much less than they once did. And while President Trump may take disdain for evidence and expert opinion to new heights, this is a change that is happening among both parties in the United States, and it's also becoming more common in other countries. For example, I think the debate over Brexit in the UK was long on inflammatory rhetoric and quite short on substance. And I think this decline in evidence-based policymaking in the United States means that US economic policy is likely to become less predictable and less successful in the years to come. And that will surely affect the American economy and our trading partners and allies. And as I'll suggest, it may have implications for how policymakers here in Ottawa and around the world want to respond. All right, well, there are three areas where the decline in evidence-based policymaking in the US has been the most extreme and is likely to have large consequences. So international trade, taxes, and the environment. So let me start with trade. First, the evidence on the benefits of international trade is pretty well established. And actually, one of the most important studies in this area looked at the relationship between trade and economic growth. Now, economists have long known that trade and income were positively correlated, right? Countries that trade more are richer. But it was impossible to know whether the countries were richer because they traded more, or did they trade more because they were richer? Well, what researchers did to try to establish the direction of causation was to point out that one important factor that determined how much trade happened was just simply the proximity of other countries. A country like Austria is likely to trade more than a country like New Zealand, just simply because it has more other countries around it. So what the study did was to first estimate the amount of trade that can be predicted just on the basis of geography, and then to test whether that relatively exogenous variation in trade is correlated with higher income. And they found that it is. All right, so this picture shows you income per worker and predicted trade in 148 countries back in 1985. And there's a decided positive relationship, shown as that upward sloping red line, and the computer is very sure that that relationship is not just there by chance. So countries that trade more just simply because of their geography are indeed richer, right? And so that suggests that trade genuinely causes economic growth. Now, of course, the evidence that trade has benefits doesn't mean that it doesn't also have costs. And in fact, it's pretty clear that there are both winners and losers from trade. So consumers and workers in export industries clearly gain, and workers whose jobs move overseas are clearly worse off. But for a country as a whole, the evidence suggests that the benefits of trade clearly outweigh the costs. Right? And actually, despite all the jokes about how much economists disagree with each other, the benefits of trade are one of the few things that economists actually agree on. Right? And there's something called the Initiative on Global Markets at the University of Chicago, which conducts periodic surveys of leading economic experts on a variety of topics. And the experts are all highly respected, lots of Nobel laureates and the like, and they reflect very much a wide range of political points of view. Yet whenever trade comes up, there is remarkable agreement. So for example, recently, the IGM asked their panel of experts whether they agreed that the steel and aluminum tariffs that were just imposed by the Trump administration would raise American welfare. Nearly 100% either disagreed or strongly disagreed. And actually, if one looks at the history of US trade policy, you see a pretty obvious decline in evidence-based policymaking in recent years. So this picture just shows you our one indicator of trade policy. That's the passage of trade agreements with other countries. And such agreements tend to reduce or eliminate trade barriers and generally make cross-border trade dramatically easier. And what's striking is the degree to which both political parties in the United States championed free trade agreements in the past and indeed worked to pass agreements started by the other party. So NAFTA was first proposed by Ronald Reagan and negotiated under President George H.W. Bush, but it was Democrat Bill Clinton who finally pushed it over the finish line. George W. Bush managed to negotiate and sign a number of free trade agreements, including an important one with Central America. But when he left office, there were 3 of them that were undone: Colombia, South Korea, and Panama. Now, President Obama is not an instinctive free trader. I think his early years as a community organizer made him acutely aware of the devastating impact that increased trade can have on Rust Belt communities. But he's also incredibly smart and very willing to listen to evidence that doesn't necessarily fit his worldview. And he was persuaded by the evidence that signing those Bush-era trade agreements would be good for the country and indeed the rest of the world. And so the announcement of his support for the most consequential of those agreements, the free trade agreement with South Korea, is associated in my mind with another one of my embarrassments in Washington. It was actually during President Obama's first State of the Union address in January of 2010. And along with the rest of his cabinet, I was seated at the front of the House chamber to listen to the speech. But I had, of course, read the speech so many times that I knew when the line about supporting the South Korea Free Trade Agreement was coming, and I was on my feet applauding before the words were even out of the president's mouth. And it took me a moment to realize that no one else was standing, except for Ron Kirk, the U.S. Trade Representative. Right? So that should have been my early warning that something was changing in the mood in Washington. Now, you can see from the graph that President Obama proposed and actively negotiated two wide-ranging free trade agreements, that with the European Union and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And several government reports and independent research studies suggested that the agreements would have positive economic benefits for the United States. Moreover, the TPP in particular was thought likely to have important foreign policy benefits. It would help bind the countries of the Pacific Rim together in a pro-democratic, pro-market economy group and provide a counterweight to China's rising dominance in the region. However, both these agreements languished in Congress and were effectively killed by the 2016 presidential election, or at least the U.S. participation in them. Donald Trump was strongly against them, but so were Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, the two candidates for the Democratic nomination in 2016. Indeed, I found Secretary Clinton's lack of support for TPP particularly heartbreaking, right? She had helped to help lead the drive for TPP as Secretary of State, and had spoken eloquently about its economic and diplomatic benefits, and yet turned away from it despite no change in the evidence. All right, so what's likely to happen in the future with trade policy in the US? I told you at the beginning that I would stay away from stark predictions, but I will go so far as to say that there is no question that the US is moving strongly away from free trade. It's happening in both political parties and is being driven by forces other than a balanced reading of the economic evidence. Indeed, the Trump administration is moving ahead with tariffs on aluminum, steel, washing machines, solar cells, and an all-out trade war between the US and China may be emerging and is likely to get worse before it gets better. Now, on the issue of NAFTA, which is the most likely to be concern of a Canadian audience, I'm a little bit at a loss about what to say, precisely because policy is being driven more by gut instinct and political posturing than by hard evidence. It's very difficult to predict what the administration will do. Seemingly every day we get conflicting reports. In one breath, the administration says negotiations are going well, everything will be fine, and in the next, President Trump threatens to blow it up, which he can do unilaterally with just 6 months' notice. I guess in my heart of hearts, I suspect that trade between Mexico, the US, and Canada is so ingrained in our supply chains and so crucial to American business that I don't think even Donald Trump would be able to just walk away from NAFTA. The outcry from businesses and Republican donors would be so strong that he would find it difficult to carry through on that extreme action. And I think the administration is very aware of stock price fluctuations, and recent moves towards our trade war with China are causing extreme gyrations. So just imagine what blowing up NAFTA would do. But while I'm optimistic that NAFTA will remain largely intact, I can almost guarantee that there will be more drama and posturing. And as if to make my point, last Thursday, President Trump mused that perhaps the United States should join the TPP after all. Now, I don't for a minute think that he was really serious, but it is a sign of just how volatile our trade policy has become that he would even float the idea after pillaring the agreement and pulling the US out of negotiations. So what are some of the possible implications of a move away from evidence-based policymaking in the area of trade for Canada and indeed for the rest of the world? Well, as I've suggested, I think US policy is inherently going to be less predictable because it's no longer being driven by fundamental facts and analysis. And as a result, Canadian trade negotiators may find that it's just very hard to negotiate sensibly and respond successfully, just as a very good tennis player can be flummoxed by a very wild one. Regardless of what Canada does, I think the outcomes of its trade negotiations with the United States are likely to be messy and illogical, and that may take a toll on both our economies. There is, however, I think, a very valuable role that Canadian policymakers and business groups could play in this area. I think the world is just hungry for a voice advocating evidence-based policymaking on trade. Canada, as a strongly export-oriented economy, is uniquely well-suited to being a leader on this issue. And I think what is most needed is a voice for trade policy that's both pro-trade and pro-worker. Part of what I think is fueling the backlash against trade is the sense that advanced economies have not done enough to help those workers who have been genuinely harmed by trade. And economists are just doing excellent work on what's called place-based policies. These are kind of a holistic approach to dealing with communities devastated by trade or technological change. They involve a range of retraining programs, incentives for new businesses to move in, and wage subsidies so that workers who lose their jobs because of trade are made whole again and their communities are rejuvenated. It would just be wonderful for another advanced economy like Canada facing similar trade adjustment issues to further test the effectiveness of these place-based policies and lead the way for the rest of us. Okay, a second area where we've seen a decline in evidence-based policymaking in the US is tax policy. And we just passed a very large tax cut that was passed almost entirely on the basis of ideology. So what does the evidence actually say about the economic effects of tax cuts? Well, first, tax cuts do tend to cause a temporary boom, right? When you cut taxes of households and businesses, they have more income left to spend. And as a result, consumption and investment tend to rise. And for a while, the increase in spending translates into more output. And in a study that I published with my husband and colleague, David Romer, back in 2010, we found that these short-run expansionary effects of tax cuts are typically big, right? So we used narrative evidence on the motivation for tax changes. So things like congressional reports and presidential speeches and Treasury documents to focus on the tax changes that are not taken in response to other developments in the economy. This gave us the best chance of finding sort of the true causal impact of tax changes. And this figure shows you what came out of that study. Right? So it shows the response of output to a tax cut of 1% of GDP, which is about the size of our most recent tax cut. And you can see that the estimated impact is a rise in national output over the subsequent few years of almost 3%. Now, importantly, the evidence suggests that these expansionary effects of tax changes come through that traditional demand channel that I just described, rather than through the supply side of the economy. And as a result, they are almost certain to fade before too long. There has, however, been an even bigger literature on what effects tax changes have on the supply side factors, like labor supply or entrepreneurial activity, the things that could be more long-lasting effects on output. And this literature, by and large, finds that the effects of tax changes on supply-side factors are very small. And that was certainly the finding of work that I did back on the 1920s and 1930s in the US. So if you think tax changes have been large recently, if you go back to the interwar period in the US, they were just phenomenal. So the top marginal tax rate was about 75% in 1920. It fell to 25% in 1929, and then went back up to 80% at the start of World War II. And the interesting thing is those changes affected different parts of the income distribution differently. And as a result, you can use the behavior of different income groups to estimate the responsiveness of income to changes in marginal tax rates. And here are the estimates that I got by year. And what you're supposed to see is that the incentive effects of cutting marginal tax rate from this period are precisely estimated to be positive, as economic theory would lead us to predict, but tiny. Well, because tax cuts do not have beneficial effects on long-run growth, as far as the evidence suggests, they do not pay for themselves, as is sometimes argued. And in fact, the evidence is very clear that tax cuts do just what common sense would lead you to believe they do. They increase a country's budget deficit, and so increase the debt to GDP ratio. And in case you were wondering how widely this view is held among economists, that IGM panel of experts that I mentioned earlier recently asked their experts about the long-run effects of the Trump tax cuts on the debt to GDP ratio. And 88% of the experts surveyed said that the US debt to GDP ratio would be substantially higher a decade from now as a result of those tax cuts. And this view was also recently expressed by our own nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. Well, economic policymaking around taxes, even in the good old days, was not always or even usually evidence-based in the United States. So for example, the idea that tax changes have strong supply-side effects is one that rears its head periodically. So Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush both cut taxes substantially despite large budget deficits. And in both cases, the tax cut was justified by saying it would increase long-run growth, and an idea that, as I mentioned, is not supported by the evidence. On the other hand, there have been times under both Democrats and Republicans when policymakers do seem to have made tax policy based squarely on the evidence. So back in the early 1990s, the first President Bush raised taxes because he was persuaded that the negative effects of the tax increase on growth would be small and that the benefits of reducing the deficit would be big. In 2008, as the housing bubble was beginning to burst and unemployment was beginning to rise, actually George W. Bush, so before President Obama ever came in, Bush had worked with Congress to pass a substantial tax cut in March of 2008. And he was absolutely following that evidence that I showed you previously, that tax cuts can have beneficial effects on spending and output in the short run. Similarly, I feel that President Obama's increase in taxes on high incomes in 2013, which was designed to reduce the deficit and inequality, was also based on sound analysis. And, I described earlier that, that President Obama valued empirical evidence. He was also really good at understanding and interpreting it. I remember before one meeting on tax policy with the president, I'd prepared a slide deck that included some of the things like I've been showing you, regression lines, standard errors. And Larry Summers, the head of the National Economic Council, said, "You can't bring a slide with regression results and standard errors into the Oval Office." And I said, let me try. The president's really smart. I'm a pretty good teacher. Not only did the president understand the evidence I was describing, the next thing I knew, he was explaining to us what might be wrong with the study. Now, sadly, with the recent tax cut, the United States has once again left the land of the evidence-based. The Trump administration has insisted that it will greatly increase growth and it will not decrease tax revenues. And as I've suggested, very few experts agree with that assessment. Well, the decline in evidence-based tax policy in the US will surely have substantial implications for the US economy and again for Canada. First, the tax cut will most likely stimulate the American economy in the short run. Output growth and employment will rise for a while, and that's the result of those strong demand side effects that I described earlier. And that's clearly what our Federal Reserve is currently thinking. So the new Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, recently said that the Fed is likely to raise interest rates faster than previously anticipated to counteract some of the short-run boom and increasing inflation generated by the tax cut. Now, faster near-term growth in the US would tend to stimulate Canadian exports and to spur GDP growth in Canada. And that could obviously be desirable, but it could also set in train some less pleasant things, like a pickup in inflation and more rapid increases in policy interest rates in Canada. Now, over the longer run, the rise in US deficits caused by the tax cut is going to be bad for us and potentially bad for the world. So in another study I've worked on recently, we look at why some countries come through financial crises with much smaller recessions than others. So for example, Germany and Australia had relatively mild recessions after the 2008 crisis, whereas Greece and Italy have had very prolonged and deep downturns. And what we find is that one of the main determinants of the variation is how much fiscal space the country had before the crisis. So fiscal space is just the term economists use to refer to the ability that a country has to take aggressive actions like increasing government spending or tax cuts. And countries with higher levels of public debt or a history of defaulting on their public debt find it harder to borrow and undertake fiscal stimulus than countries with a sound credit history. And since World War II, countries with the ability and willingness to use fiscal stimulus following a crisis have fared much better. So this graph actually shows you our estimates of what happens to real GDP following a financial crisis in a country with plenty of fiscal space, that's the red line, and a country without much fiscal space, that's the blue line. And the difference is dramatic, right? Countries with plenty of ability to use fiscal policy typically experience only a very mild recession following the financial crisis, whereas countries facing a crisis with little fiscal space see output absolutely plummet. Well, with our recent tax cut, the United States just guaranteed that we're not going to have much fiscal space going forward. We're entering that unfortunate club of countries with high debt to GDP ratios and are likely to be unwilling or unable to take aggressive action should we face another financial crisis. And this almost surely means that the US would be much less able to lead a worldwide recovery than as we did in 2008. All right, well, the best advice for Canada and for everyone is to follow the evidence, right? If the United States is pursuing unhealthy fiscal policies that may limit our ability to be a force for global stability in years to come, it's all the more important for other countries to act responsibly. Setting tax policy on the basis of realistic estimates of the short-run and long-run effects on growth is the surest way to keep a country's deficit under control and to maintain the ability to take aggressive action when it is needed. All right, finally, let me talk about American environmental policy, particularly related to climate change. This is perhaps the area where the decline in evidence-based policymaking has been the most extreme and where the consequences may be the most damaging. Now, I am the first to admit that I am not an expert on the science of climate change, but I do know enough to listen to the people who are. And the amount of professional agreement among the chemists and physicists who actually study climate is truly astounding. So this excerpt actually comes from the NASA website, our US Space Agency. 97% of publishing climate scientists believe that climate change is happening and is related to human activity. Now, there is, of course, uncertainty about how rapidly climate change is happening and the severity of the consequences, but there's little doubt that global warming is raising ocean levels, causing more extreme weather patterns, and decreasing biodiversity. Well, for much of the past 25 years, American politicians from both parties have at least acknowledged the reality that climate change is happening and have looked for ways to try to counteract it. And policy has been driven, at least in part, by the scientific evidence. So Bill Clinton and his Vice President Al Gore helped to negotiate one of the first agreements to try to, international agreements to reduce CO2 emissions, the Kyoto Protocol, though the United States Congress never managed to agree to sign it. George W. Bush actually instituted tax incentives for renewable energy. And even Mitt Romney, who ran against President Obama in 2012, supported a number of initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions when he was governor of Massachusetts, including a regional cap-and-trade program. And President Obama was utterly passionate about this issue and about the evidence. And let me just give you one other example of evidence-based policymaking from my time in Washington. So in the American regulatory process, the government is supposed to consider both the costs and benefits of any new regulation. And with regulations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it was often very easy to identify the costs to businesses and consumers, but not the benefits. And so a number of cabinet agencies, led by mine, set up a working group to map the existing science about climate change into a rigorous estimate of the social cost of carbon. Only by putting a dollar value on the damage caused by carbon could we have an estimate of the dollar benefit of reducing carbon emissions. And this involved thinking hard about things like how to weight the welfare of future generations, how to value the loss of coastal land, how to estimate the economic impact of changes in growing seasons, and lots more. And it was a really time-consuming project that included both scientists and economists. And here's what came out of the research, right? It was an agreed-upon range for the social cost of carbon and how it was going to evolve over time. And the US government agreed that reducing carbon emissions by a ton, so roughly the impact of burning 2 fewer barrels of crude oil, had an average benefit of $40 today, and the benefits would rise to about $65 over the next 30 years. Now, this seemingly minor technical exercise actually provided the empirical basis for a number of major new regulations during the Obama administration. So, for example, it led the government to impose a rule preventing the construction of new coal-fired power plants because the dollar value of the economic benefits of carbon reduction outweighed the economic costs of using more expensive fuels like wind and solar and natural gas. Well, since taking office, President Trump and his Environmental Protection Agency have rolled back many of the Obama-era measures to combat climate change. He's withdrawn the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, opened the way for new coal-fired power plants, appears to be planning to loosen automobile efficiency standards, and just rescinded the government's use of these carefully estimated values of the social cost of carbon. But as distressing as I find that the changes in policy, I think what frightens me more is the loss of that crucial compass of evidence, right? Nobody on the left or the right can make policy well without knowing what the evidence says about the costs and benefits of any action. And a development that's been in the American news, at least recently, is a decision by the Environmental Protection Agency to not allow the use of any studies for which the raw data can't be published. Now, this may sound like a sensible move to increase transparency, but it's likely to have a chilling effect on environmental regulation. And the reason is that most medical data that we use to look at the health effects of pollution and climate change are by their nature confidential and can't be published. And as a result, the rule will inevitably limit the evidence available to guide pollution regulation. Well, this decline in evidence-based policymaking on the environment means that the US will surely make much less progress on combating climate change than we should. And we will not be a force for international cooperation on this crucial issue. And all of our children and grandchildren, I fear, will pay the price for that retreat from science and evidence. Importantly, I think Canada is also facing difficult choices on climate policy. Like the United States, your country must decide between the short-run gain from producing and using fossil fuels that you and we have in abundance with the long-run harms to the environment. And I can ask for nothing more than that your policymakers use the best evidence available as they make those decisions. Well, you know, when I was serving in the Obama administration, I got kind of pegged as the optimistic member of the economics team. One time, a newspaper ruined an otherwise very flattering profile of me with the headline, "Obama's Sunny Economic Forecaster." Some of it surely has to do with that overly optimistic forecast that I mentioned at the beginning. But personally, I just think that anyone looks cheerful next to Larry Summers. And if you doubt that, you can see the pictures here. I'm the cheerful, smiling one in the red dress, and Larry is the scary one at the other end. Now, I obviously haven't been particularly optimistic this evening. I think the decline in evidence-based policymaking in the United States and elsewhere in the world is, to me, a truly terrifying trend. It means that our government is making policy without the crucial input of facts, analysis, and expert opinion. And as a result, I think policy is going to be less predictable and much less successful. And it also means that countries like Canada, whose economy is entwined with that of the United States, may also be in for a wild ride. But I guess I'm enough of an optimist to hope that the current trend away from evidence won't last. So democracy is a powerful tool, and I think sooner or later voters will be tired of the wild swings in policy that don't deal with the very real problems that they face. I think the evidence-based community throughout the world can also help lead the way. And actually, one reason why I was excited to talk with you all this evening is that groups like the CFA Society are dedicated to high professional standards and making decisions based on careful analysis and study. You understand that expert isn't a dirty word, it's a badge of honor. Right? And I think we all need to work to bring those values not just to our jobs, but to our politics and our government. Because only then will public policy once again truly serve the public interest. Thank you. And I think the plan is now to open it up for questions. And there are microphones, if you can, I see them waving them in the back. I, of course, because the lights can't see anything, so we hope somebody will yell if you have a question. So, do we have any questions? Or if I just depressed you, no end. Yes, I see one right here.
Christina, I was going to ask, of all the countries that you're studying, is there sort of perhaps a better poster child for fact-based policies today?
So the question is, because one of the things, obviously the country I know best is the United States, and one of the things, especially if you've been in government, watching things change is very painful. And the question is, what's happening around the world? And one of the things that I do find frightening is what we're seeing in the United States is not just a US phenomenon. It is something that is happening in many countries around the world. In terms of where things are looking better, I think that I don't feel like I have a good sense of every country that's out there. From your southern border, Canada often looks like a place. So I'll give you an example of one thing that does impress me about Canada. So a big issue in the United States is what should monetary policy do? And what should be the guiding force for monetary policy? Should you have an inflation target, whatever? And one of the things that the Bank of Canada does by legislation is every 5 years kind of rethink that operating strategy. And one of the things I've been pushing for in the United States is we need to do something like that. We need to rethink that strategy. And so I think that's an example of a country, certainly of a central bank, doing something that is very good and important. I'll give you another example. I think Japan, right, which is a poster child for first how not to deal with a financial crisis. So when they had a financial crisis in the early 1990s, and it just went on for the lost decade. One of the things that was really interesting in the last 5 or 6 years is the big change in monetary policy, or actually, and Prime Minister Abe was actually bringing in tons of American economists to meet, and I was one of the ones that met with him to talk about what should he do about the value-added tax, what should he do about fiscal policy. And I was so impressed that he just wanted evidence, right? So those are 2 examples that I've seen. What else?
Hello.
Okay, as I said.
Apparently there's
You're just
evidence.
a blob back there.
There's evidence that major corporations in the U.S. are in a situation of holding extreme liquidity relative to their historic balances of cash. Can you explain why that might be and what, if anything, is driving that process?
Again, a great question. So the question is sort of why are U.S. companies holding huge amounts of cash? And there are lots of explanations. I think one that I'm very sort of sympathetic to, again, maybe coming from having studied the Great Depression, is I think just as was mentioned earlier, that 2008 crisis was an unbelievably searing event for many businesses, right? So when your financial markets completely freeze and you can't get credit to make payroll or any of those things. So I can certainly see that as a mechanism for why corporations want to sit on more cash, why they're afraid to put it into productive investment. I do also think, we had one of the fun questions was about uncertainty, and Dave couldn't bear to look at the figure, but policy uncertainty, I think, is a real thing. It was something that was brought up a lot during the Obama administration of, were we creating policy uncertainty, and that was making, say, businesses afraid to invest. I think we are seeing that again, and again, not just in the US, But think about Brexit. I can't think of anything that is more of, talk about policy uncertainty about what's going to be happening in your basic trade relationships and in such an important trade relationship. And I think we're seeing some of the same thing in the United States. If I were an American business sort of wondering what's going to happen to NAFTA, what's going to happen to my taxes, what's going to happen to lots of things, I think is another reason why you'd be sitting on cash. But I'm sure there are many other explanations besides that. Pardon?
Now what I really want to know is where should I put my personal money?
And you know what I'm really not going to tell you? It's where you should put your personal money. Yes, another question. Oh, I see one here. All right, so the question, since we didn't have the microphone, so I've talked a lot about tax policy. We could have had on the docket what about monetary policy and things. And certainly in the study that I was describing about the importance of fiscal space, the other thing that matters for how well a country does coming out of a financial crisis is, did they have monetary policy space? If you start the crisis with your policy interest rate down at 1, you have a lot less room to at least do conventional monetary policy than if you start at a more normal level like 5 or 6. And so absolutely the data are consistent with that as well. I think your big question, I think, is a fundamental one, which is we do seem to be in a world where inflation is quite low and policy interest rates are really low worldwide, or certainly in advanced economies. And so the conventional tools of monetary policy, which 10 years ago I would teach my students that's our first line of defense against a recession. We don't have much in the way of our first line of defense anymore because interest rates are so low. If a country like the United States is now projected to have a debt to GDP ratio of close to 100% in 10 years, we're not going to be able to do something like the Recovery Act, another $800 billion fiscal stimulus if something bad happens. So I think that is, to me, a big risk, that we have fewer tools. And I think, one of the things that comes out of that study of looking at what is it that helps some country do better after financial crises than others is you want to maintain your policy space. And so that means, for a lot of countries, that means don't let your inflation rate get too low, because what's the main thing that's keeping a lot of interest rates very low? It's quite low inflation. And you don't want your debt to GDP ratio to go through the roof, because that is tying your hands on the fiscal side. So I think the answer is the US is putting itself in a position to not have much policy space. And so again, for kind of everybody else, please do as I say, not as we are doing, because I think that the US is not going to be able to play as useful a role as we should. On unconventional monetary policy, it kind of comes back to this issue we talked about with the Bank of Canada. I think in general, understanding that we're in a world where low inflation is as much a problem as high inflation really is suggesting we need to rethink our monetary policy. If we're going to have to be using unusual monetary policy actions, unconventional, we need to understand them better. Or maybe you want to have a different monetary policy framework. Maybe you want to target nominal GDP, or maybe, in fact, 2% is not the magic inflation rate, and maybe a slightly higher rate would mean that in normal times, your normal interest rate is somewhat higher, so you've got more room to cut if you face a recession. These are not answered questions, but they're questions that ought to be asked and researched and thought about, rather than just going on sort of a policy autopilot.
What are the catalysts, and what is your forecast for the next US recession?
Okay, I think the main thing to say, right, so I really believe that study that I showed you that tax cuts have expansionary effects. in the short run. So actually, I would probably put myself as fairly bullish about the US economy. I think if anything, we're more likely to see the economy grow maybe faster than we were anticipating, inflation perhaps starting to pick up faster than we thought. And so while I understand recessions are a terrible thing and everyone's worried about them, I think at least for the next couple of years, the more likely thing is that the US economy may maybe be a little stronger than is necessarily healthy for, say, the rate of inflation and things like that. But those effects will fade, and there are certainly, so as they fade, that raises, obviously, recession risk. And then a lot of the other things that we've talked about or that we're all nervous about. So an all-out trade war, big gyrations in stock markets, all of those things can depress investment, depress consumer spending. Those would be your kind of catalysts that I'd be looking for. And part of why I want to bring us back to the evidence and the data is precisely so that we are making policy based on sort of predictable, sensible things and not gyrating around and causing the kinds of things that could depress investment and consumption and ultimately trigger a recession. What else?
Have governments evolved to be
Okay, so this voice is coming out of nowhere. I can't see you. Okay. There you are.
I'm back again for the third time.
You have no idea how bright this light is. Here, I'm going to move this way. Excellent.
Have governments evolved to actually taking up too large a proportion of the economy?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to say that.
Have governments evolved such that they're driving too much of the economy? They're taking up too much of the proportion of the general economy of most countries?
It's a fine question. So the ideas are somehow governments getting too big. And, I think, again, that's not a question, I think. An economist could talk about, what's it, doing to innovation, what's it doing to incentives. But ultimately, how big you want the government is a value judgment, and that's what voters, I think, are designed to do. But I do think, certainly when I think, say, of the US economy, we're definitely, the change that actually bothers me more than the size of government, it's been more the composition of government. So as we've decided we want to cut taxes, and we don't want to cut a bunch of things like military spending or our entitlement programs, which I obviously support. What does end up getting cut is actually some of the most useful stuff. So the investment in education, investment in children, investment in basic scientific research, the kinds of things that in our past, so in the 1960s, the 1950s, ended up being an incredible engine of growth by doing the kind of investment that a firm doesn't want to do, right? So firms are happy to do R&D. Firms don't do basic science because you can't patent basic science, and there aren't the incentives for an individual company to do that research. That's the classic role for government, and that is what often is the starting point for R&D that turns into products that people love and that businesses make a lot of money from. So more than just the size of government, I think the composition of government has gone in a bad direction, at least in the United States, and that we're not having that kind of government investment spending in infrastructure and basic science and the things that make an economy grow and really prosper.
All right, pretty basic question. What if Trump is right and his non-evidence-based policy leads to strong economic growth in the United States and happens to get him reelected for the next term?
So I think the most important thing is to say, if you, as I do, believe strongly in evidence-based policy, if I get evidence that says I was completely wrong and it really is, these are the, getting rid of trade agreements really is an engine of growth, I think we would need to update our priors. I think exactly what is important is that we not think we have the answers, that where anybody makes a mistake is to assume you know what's right. And actually, I'll cite Janet Yellen, the former Fed chair, is a very dear friend of mine. And one of the things that she would do before, this was back when she was president of the San Francisco Fed, she would say, you know, she'd talk to her advisors, they'd have, this is how I'm going to vote. But before she finished, she'd say, all right, suppose we're completely wrong. Suppose, you know, the other side or, you know, somebody else's view is right. What would be the evidence that that was the case? How would we want to change our view? And I think that is exactly what every policymaker ought to do. You should always be open to the possibility that the best studies may still not have captured everything. And so if we find evidence that this is the answer, we're going to have to do some serious economic research and figure out why our current research seems to be giving other answers. So I think that's the main thing I want to say on that. And, but I think in general, evidence-based policymaking is a really good thing, but you have to be open to learning. And I think that's the essence for how anybody does well and how economies do well.
Professor Romer, I think it's fair to conclude that you do not approve of the current administration's policy decision-making process. But how do you explain, and I guess the other gentleman sort of asked this question, how do you explain the disconnect between non-empirical decision-making policies and the fact that the stock market seems to not care, which is the business that we're in, helping investors? So how do you reconcile this difference?
No, I mean, I will say absolutely I've been surprised by how the stock market has done. I think we have also seen the stock market come down a fair amount in the last several months. So certainly at some point, and I guess maybe, I mean, there are a couple of things to say. When I described tax policy, so think about what I've been describing. I haven't said that the tax cut is bad for the economy in the short run. In fact, I feel very strongly it's going to be good for the US economy in the short run in the sense of it does tend to pump up GDP. And so for a while it will do that. So I'm not surprised that if we do a big tax cut, the stock market goes up, right? So that is an example of something I think is a short-sighted policy. I think it's not ultimately going to be healthy for our ability to fight recessions in the future. I do believe that large budget deficits eventually do crowd out private investment, which is sort of what one of the previous questions had to do with. But as a short-run policy and what it's going to do to the US economy, if anything, it's going to make us boom rather than go into a recession. So that's an example. And then actually I think the fact that the stock market does seem to be unnerved by the trade war talk is an example of what I do think is a dangerous policy, a non-evidence-based policy, starting to, for people realizing it would have real consequences for business, for the productivity of the economy. And I do think that that's important. So I think that is a good question to ask, but that's how I'd answer it.
Hello.
Yeah.
You keep talking about taxes. Have you done any studies on looking the optimal marginal tax rate with maximum productivity to give us a smoothing out of the short-term and long-term GDP as you're talking about?
I haven't actually done any research on that myself. I think the important thing to realize, I mean, of course, economic theory, right, any of our analysis is going to say at some point when marginal tax rates get high enough, they have a disincentive effect. And it's just, you know, it makes sense that if you're taxing 99% of an extra dollar that someone earns, they're probably not going to work all that hard to earn the extra dollar. I think within the relevant range where we have, say, seen the variation in the US, it doesn't seem to have very big impacts. So it does, that doesn't mean that if you went super high, it wouldn't matter. And then in terms of, there have been, so like my colleague Emmanuel Saez at Berkeley has done some work sort of saying what we know about these sensitivities and things. I think his view would certainly be that fairly high marginal rates do not have negative effects on the economy and may have beneficial effects for inequality and things like that. So I think the more important thing is to think about why you're making your tax policy. If you're fundamentally doing your tax policy because you've got to pay for the things that we like coming from our government, then I think you want to think about how do you raise that money that has the least disincentive effects, and how do you make sure that you do in fact pay for what we're spending so that our debt to GDP ratio doesn't go off to large and unsustainable levels.
Thank you very much, Professor. I appreciate your presentation. I'd like to go back to a comment, a fairly optimistic comment I think that you made earlier, which was to say that the shift away from evidence-based decision-making is a pendulum that might come back. One of the concerns that I have is that the shift away from evidence-based decision-making has a consequence, or it's a chicken and egg thing, that attracts less competent leaders. And if you look around the world, I believe that there's maybe a dearth of choice between competent leaders. I worry that we're going down a path that's not a pendulum, but a little bit of a spiral. And I'd just like your comments on that.
I think you're getting outside my area of expertise, but I guess, what do I think? The optimist in me comes back, right? So as I said, it wasn't that long ago that we had Barack Obama, who, you don't have to like his policies or whatever, but who had a deep respect for evidence and understanding evidence. And so I think that is, so I don't think we have to say we've gone down a rabbit hole or whatever. I do think if you, again, kind of push me more on the politics than on the economics, I do want to come back to this idea that I think and economists are a big part of the problem here. We were, especially say on the trade issue, we were focusing so much on the aggregate benefits. And I firmly believe that a country's real GDP is higher when it trades more. I think that is ultimately a good thing for the overall economy, for innovation, all those things. But I think there's a big disconnect between that and saying it's good for everybody, because absolutely there have been big chunks of the US population that have been harmed by trade. And so I think the real answer, that what you're looking for in your politicians, is both someone who follows the evidence where it leaves, but also I think the understanding that some people have been deeply hurt, and I think that is a big part of why we're seeing anti-trade, populist, a lot of the changes that we're seeing in the political arena. So I think there's room for the melding of the two things. That was sort of one of the things I was trying to say. I think there are good ideas about how you could actually make people whole that have been hurt by trade, and that needs to be a part of the conversation. It can't just be, let's just have trade because it's good, because some people are very hurt, and until you realize that and until we address that, I think you may still have a lot of these political dynamics.
How about a round of applause for Professor
Thank you.
Romer, and taking the time to answer all those questions as well.
Thank you.
At this time, that concludes our evening, which is pretty much right on schedule. Whoever had a bet on that, or if you took the over or the under, we pretty much brought in the plane right on time. However, some people prefer to stay up later than others, and as a result, there are other establishments that sell alcohol. One of them is called the Shore Club, and it's in the lobby of the Westin, and that is where everyone is invited to drink and mingle and follow up on the thoughts that have been provoked, and to drink until there's less evidence, I guess, is the right way to handle that. So, to hell with evidence. Let's get drunk. That's the point. We can all take away from what Professor Romer was telling us. Stop thinking, I think, was the main takeaway, because nobody's using it anymore. So you can waste. You don't have to keep adding stuff up. Nobody cares what the answers are, really. Just say a number. That's what I'm hearing here. And less time in the classroom. That's great news. All right, thanks very much for having me back, and congrats on the Forecaster of the Year CFA Ottawa Dinner Circa 2018. Thanks, everybody.